All
I think
right.
we're live, yeah. Well,
Yeah.
hello and welcome.
Hello.
This is my second person teaches Eppy about thing. The first one was with Shell Khan teaching me about merch, and this one is Tyler teaches Eppy about playwriting, and this is Tyler Crumrine.
Yes.
Last name
Yes.
correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I am what people in the theater industry call a dramaturg, which is a far more important sounding thing than it actually is.
It's a very sorcerous sounding word.
Yeah, it's super German, just like a lot of you know detailed but sometimes unnecessary things.
Yeah.
So a dramaturg is, the word shares similar roots with like metallurge.
Okay.
And a dramaturg is someone who helps to create plays. The same way that a metallurge kind of is the person who is melting down the different materials and compounds and things to make, this, like, all right, now we've got iron or steel or what have you. I should know this. I'm from Pittsburgh. But a dramaturg is kind of equal parts a editor and a research assistant for playwrights. And it's something that I kind of stumbled into. I fell in love with the theater as an actor and then very quickly burnt out because it's very stressful memorizing a lot of lines, and realized that what I loved was the experience of rehearsing and spending time in text and kind of getting to know these stories and interpreting, like, all right, what does this line mean? What is this character motivation? All those different kinds of things. That put me on the path of dramaturgy. And it's that same kind of passion for performance and, really getting into the meat and the head and the heart of characters that really made me fall in love with role-playing games too. Because it was a number of my theater friends, comedy improv friends, folks who were interested in playing. I was always a bit of an indoor kid, but unfortunately one that lived on a mountain. So when there was this perfect storm with my friends and I of folks who wanted to play RPGs, I was just like, hey, I will buy all the books. I'll learn it all. I'll run it for you. And kind of since then, I've been, continuing my path as a theater professional and as a dramaturg, working in different literary offices and things like that. But in my own time, game design has kind of been that sweet spot for me of, between the like authorial intent of playwriting,
Right.
but also kind of the community improv stuff of theater. So yeah, I was recently at the Kennedy Center in DC. They were looking for a dramaturg to help with new play development for a show that was being done down there by a playwright named Dev Blair. They were working on a show called A Game of Life that was a dramatic ritual that had a lot of tabletop RPG elements in it, and that was encouraging audience interaction to make different decisions at parts of the play. So they were looking for someone who had experience with new play development, but also had a knowledge of RPGs,
Nice.
just kind of narrative game vocabulary and things like that.
So if I'm going to start asking some questions.
No, I'm sorry.
No, it's all right.
It's the theater influence. I'm just monologuing.
Yeah, that's good. First of all, if I should warn you, I am not entirely a neophyte in this area.
Yeah, that was going to be one of my first questions. What is like your theater history?
I actually wrote a play that was put on. It was, I think it's off Broadway is the technical term. That's for those, as I understand it. You can correct me if I'm wrong here, but for those listening, that the number of offs is how few seats you had in the audience or something like that.
Yeah, something along those lines.
I think there was like somewhere between 80 and 100 seats.
That's a decent space, especially in New York. Yeah,
I think I may be exaggerating in my brain. It was a decade ago. Some people that I knew they ran like a contest where they had a bunch of monster plays. The theme was like a monster thing, and I'd written a play that I had called Raymond Carver's Dracula, which was
nice.
My interpretation of what a vampire story written by Raymond Carver would be like. And as far as I know, it's only received one review, but it was a positive review, so yeah. I'm 100% fresh on Rotten Tomatoes. If that's...
Exactly. Lauded playwright.
Yeah, and I took quite a few theater courses in high school and in college, but those were even longer ago. So yeah. I don't know a whole lot about theater. I know that at some point I knew more than I do now, because that's how my brain works. But the reason why I stopped you was that dramatic ritual, is this a technical term, or is this like something that they're trying to apply to what they're doing, or is this new?
This was more of a term for what they were applying to what they were doing. They were interested in, I was just reading Swords Without Master the other day, preparing for our conversation. And I really loved how there is a vocabulary of ritual in that too.
Yeah.
As kind of a prompt for, this is how it is time for engagement. This is how there is a task to be done. And they are a playwright of color. They were writing a distinctly Afrocentric world, a fantasy world of their own creation, where they wanted to incorporate dance elements, ritual elements in that, pulling from a number of non-Western religions and things, a lot of gods' names for characters in the show. So ritual was something that kind of did a really elegant job of incorporating the world of the play and also the purpose of the play, kind of like a medium is the message type of thing.
Yeah, no, that's good. It's very evocative. I like, if you're going to see a dramatic ritual, you definitely come with a different mindset that you would if you were just going to go to see a play.
Exactly. And that was one of the things where, so I guess two things before we get back to Dev's play,
sure.
Because it is really one of the things that I want to touch on in this conversation is, to your point of not being, a theater expert, but being, familiar with theater, having spent some time studying writing plays. Honestly, I tend to see that as an asset. I think that there are, a lot of really great things about theater. I don't think it's by any means like the be all end all of literature. And I also think that, there are a number of bad habits that you can get into when you write a lot of plays or attend a lot of the same play. The same way how role players can get into very bad habits, where they're, like, well, this is how I always did this before. And, they have a harder time breaking out of that mold when maybe you're like, hey, this is a diceless game and we're actually going to need you to stretch these muscles. It's cool that you know this one thing really well, but we're going to do this other thing. So, yeah, I actually, in addition to my development work that I do for other people, I run a small press called Plays in Verse. And a lot of what I do there is work with first-time playwrights, often poets, prose writers. I'm working with a graphic novelist right now who's writing their first play, precisely because I think it's a lot easier to teach dramatic structure and some of the tools that we're going to talk about today than it is to teach someone how to have a unique voice. Or in role-playing terms, I think it's a lot easier to teach someone like, hey, when you roll odds, it means this, than teaching someone how to like be comfortable, like coming out of their shell in a role-playing environment. So that was the first point. And the second point was just kind of to what a dramaturg does. So I mentioned that we're kind of one part editor, one part research assistant. So in the context of this ritual play, Game of Life, my role was to, in a lot of ways, be a playtester for the play. And even if it weren't as, game-centric a play, this would be the case in a lot of other scenarios too. I'm kind of the educated first audience for something that, sits with the playwright and doesn't necessarily say to them like, hey, this was bad. You thought you knew how to write a play, but I'm going to tell you how to really write a play. No, it's a lot more of just sitting with a playwright and saying like, hey, this bit was a bit unclear. Like, what are we going for here? Or like, that scene felt a little slow to me. Did it feel that way to you? Or, a lot of what I'll do too is I will moderate audience talkbacks. So after a reading of a play or a production of a play, I'll sit up on the stage with the playwright and say, hey, we're going to have, a chance for you to ask questions in the playwright. We're going to ask some questions from you. And it would be things like, when did you feel most engaged in the play? When did you feel least engaged in the play? What especially resonated with you about the play? What were you confused about? And one of the things in this, so the way that I got here was you're saying that like you have a certain expectation when you go into a play that has ritual in the title. One of the things that we were surprised by in the audience talkback is that the audience really wanted more ritual and wanted more games in the text itself. A lot of what we had been working on as we were workshopping this piece was like, okay, how much can we expect of the audience that maybe doesn't have this game's vocabulary? And how much can we expect of actors as far as like, okay, this much is going to be scripted, this much is going to be improvised. But I think in part because the title is a game of life, a dramatic ritual, the people who naturally gravitated towards that were going in like, I want to play a game.
Yeah.
Like the thing that was advertised to me was a game. Let's get some more game in there. And so a lot of the next step of the play will be kind of finding more room for that playfulness, for the game mechanics, and still trying to thread that needle of, how much can we expect of the audience? And if thinking of the audience as players, how much can we expect of players? And how quickly, if there are any rules that we need to teach them about this experience, what do we need to have a tutorial for at the beginning? And what can we kind of assume that like, okay, if they see it done, they're going to naturally know how this moves forward.
Yeah, it's a really intriguing design challenge. I know, so I have a vaguely hostile relationship with some of this stuff. Not with what
That's
you're
fine. So do I. Yeah.
But I sometimes say things like, "Oh, it's interactive like a DVD menu," where sometimes things are sold to me as interactive, and where interactive means I get to choose the part that I'm watching, and that's it, or whatever. And that doesn't sound like what you're doing here, which is really interesting because you are offering the audience some sort of engagement, and they're asking for more, and you're looking to give them more, which is really, really quite interesting. I know I will role play at the drop of a hat, but if certain performance elements that I've not been able to identify come up, I go like completely stone cold on it. Yeah. And it's weird, right? Because I can sit down at a table or even do the live streams and have, not that much trouble doing it. But then if you got like a whole audience there and then you ask me to stand up to say something, even if that thing is just scripted or anything, I just freeze up a little bit. So do you find that that's like do you have like a barrier with your audience there, or are they all coming in going, I want to get up and engage?
I think sometimes it takes a specific kind of audience. And I think there's nothing wrong necessarily with writing for that audience either.
Yeah.
In the same way that like there are plenty of game systems that if something doesn't work for you, the solution isn't always like break yourself of your habits so that this is the game that you play now. Sometimes the solution is just play a different game. And so a lot of times as an editor, my questions for a playwright will be like, okay, so this is a reference that a specific subset of people are going to get, but a broad audience probably won't. I'm not telling you to take it out. Are you cool with that?
Right.
Like, how much of this play do you want to, you know, do you want this to be a piece that has a little bit for everyone? Or are you okay with this being a piece that is most at home in an 80 to 100 seat theater that, you know, maybe runs for a couple weekends rather than trying to, like, you know, be the next Sleep No More or something like that and, you know, run for years and years and years. I think that sometimes that's also the job not of the playwright, but of the producing body, of just making sure that as you get word out about a play, that you're actually talking about that play, that you are selling the thing that it is and not something else. Because if you sell a play as something that is like, this is a revolutionary piece of interactive theater and you're going to be a member of the play, and then they attend and it's like, well, this is choose your own adventure.
Right.
You know, it wasn't so much that I was like crafting the story. It was that like I was choosing one of three options, which is definitely also a viable way of doing interactive theater. But you don't want to oversell it or undersell it either. And so I think that, yeah, that is something that is difficult to find. And there's also the conversation of, you know, what is the difference between a piece of interactive theater with improv elements and just, you know, straight up improv? Like, what is making this a play rather than narrative improv or long form improv? And that's something that I still am figuring out the kind of boundaries of. And I think that there's definitely a lot of interplay there. But I also am more excited by these kind of experiments than, you know, just going to another like tidy 3-act structure play. Especially as someone who my living is reading hundreds and hundreds of plays and trying to sort out the ones that are saying something new. A lot of times it's harder to find a story that someone hasn't told before. And it's easier to find someone telling a story that resonates, but are maybe telling it in a way that is new and different.
Cool. Yeah. So
go ahead.
Sorry. I was going to say, do we want to talk a little bit about that standard 3-act a little bit? So we have a baseline for everyone to where we're coming from, or do you have more, like, you can go ahead and keep going on what you're riffing on there if you prefer.
Yeah, I think getting more into kind of a bit of the nuts and bolts of playwriting at this point is a great way to go. I've actually been thinking a lot about it and I actually shared this with the actors and the artistic team that I was working with down at the Kennedy Center. Was something that came up between your conversation with Alex on Backstory. Of thinking of RPGs as an algorithm for emergent narratives, for emergent storytelling. In a lot of ways, that's what plays are as well. It's just a lot more fixed variables. You know, with RPGs, it is very much like, okay, we have quantity X and quantity Y, and you are going to put in things that once it's run through this formula, you know, we're going to figure out what's on the other end. Whereas with a play, you kind of already have the entire formula. You kind of have both sides of the equation. And the work of it is more kind of finding that balance and figuring out as a creative team, like, okay, we know these things to be true. We know where we're going to arrive at the end. You know, why is this inevitable? Why is this something that you know, we are going to invest time in? And that's the same reason why you know, people will put on Shakespeare's over and over and over again. In role-playing games, a lot of the agency is, you know, making a decision and kind of like overcoming an obstacle. Whereas in a theater performance experience, it is much more like you have a script. The things that you are deciding are less like what you say and what you do, and more like the delivery. More what is the specific flavor that you're going to add to this that kind of leans one way or another on this.
That was so. My background before all of this is in fiction writing, and with a very acute focus on short fiction, the short story and whatnot, and which is one of my two favorite forms of fiction, the other being role-playing games. But so when I wrote my play, I essentially, like, you know, I wrote a short story and then formatted it as a play. You know, I mean, obviously you can't do just that, but it was very that was sort of the process that I went through. I just took what I understood about writing a short story and tried to make a play out of it. And one of the eye-opening moments that seems super obvious now, but it wasn't obvious to me at the time. They sat me down and talked to me, you know, after they're like, oh, we're going to do this, but here we're going to need to do this. Every character is going to have an actor, and that actor needs to know about that character.
Yeah.
And it's perfectly fine when you're writing short fiction for the author to know about the character and to only give you the smallest hint, only what's needed for the actual story. But if you're going to have someone else interpret it, then you need to give them something to work with, you know? And that was very interesting. It was not a thing at the time that I mean, it's like I said, it's obvious now, but it wasn't a thing I was thinking about. It wasn't like, oh, now I have to provide this. Everyone needs to know why they're there and what they're trying to get out of it.
Yeah. And I think there's definitely, you know, room for empty spaces in that process as well.
Yeah.
You know, it really depends on what are the vital things to make sure that, you know, you as a playwright are not going to be able to be at every performance. And if there is a specific message that you want to get across, you need there to be just enough information that if someone, you know, kind of picks up the instruction booklet that is this play, that they are going to be able to, you know, convey your artistic statement to the audience. But if it is not important for you, that like, oh, this character is a specific age, or this character is a specific race, or anything like that, you know, a lot of that editing process can even be stripping out those things to say like, okay, what are the character details that are vital to the plot and that kind of dovetail into the themes of the play itself? And what are the things that maybe we can, you know, leave some room for designers to kind of step into that space and say like, okay, well, this is my moment of agency. Or, you know, hey, actor, you know that this character, you know, responds to these things in these ways, but whether it's them, you know, genuinely being upset, or if they are being facetious, or, you know, if they are just kind of putting on a brave face, as long as they can justify it with other parts of the text, I think that that can be exciting and valid too. And that kind of goes back to the Shakespeare. You know, we have a lot of, you know, a lot of different models for how a play can be done, but people continue to find other ones because there are enough of those holes. There's another play that I really love. It's by Sarah Kane. It's called 4.48 Psychosis. And it's really intense. So trigger warning to folks. It deals with like a lot of heady subjects, most of all suicide. But it is a play that has no line attributions and no stage directions. Just has line, 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 and not even necessarily paragraphs of lines. It's almost structured more like a verse play. And so when people perform that play, because there are so many empty spaces, you know, they could have a cast of 2, they could have a cast of 7. They could decide that like, okay, this page of lines are all this character, this page of lines is going to be this character, and we're just going to mix them up on this one. And sometimes that can be really cool. Also, sometimes it means, though, that when you go to a production of this show, it could be absolute garbage because there is such a light touch from the playwright that they might miss the point entirely. It's a really beautiful show about kind of, you know, how everyone has depressive tendencies, and it really humanizes the character. And I saw a production of it once that was just very much like, man, crazy people are scary, right? Oh. Just like, you know, leaned into ableist language in their program and things like that. And it's just like, yeah, you missed the point.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's another role of the dramaturg. You know, we are the person who is kind of the champion of the text, who would, like, if I were working that show, I would maybe bring in an interview with the playwright, or I would do some contextual research and provide it to the artistic team, depending on how much they want. Because again, sometimes, you know, it is very helpful for a cast to be like, hey, you don't have to spend some of your valuable hours in the library researching everything about Elizabethan England. I'm just going to give you like this packet of 5 pages that teaches you the words you need to know for this play. And sometimes, you know, a director, though, will also say like, hey, I actually don't want you to give them anything. We're kind of going to figure it out as a group. You know, too many cooks in the kitchen, and I'll no longer be like the chief creative leader in the room.
That's interesting. So I'm suddenly realizing that I have just maybe contextualized wrong where the dramaturge sits. So do you work with the playwright? Do you work with the actors and the director? Do you work with everyone? Or
yes. Okay. That's why it's so hard to get jobs as a dramaturg. A lot of theaters also don't know exactly what they do. So it really is a case-by-case basis.
Okay.
Right. I don't, and maybe this is why sometimes I don't get jobs, but right. I don't think that a dramaturg is necessary to every process. A lot of times it really is on a project-to-project or a writer-to-writer basis.
That is really interesting.
So there are writers that are like, you know, very, very good about, you know, just creating characters that are believable, that are moving, but they aren't great about self-editing. Or maybe they're like, okay, it is really crucial for me that this play is set in, you know, the antebellum South, but it's because of the effect that it would have on these characters. I don't have the time or resources or the skills to like do the research necessary that someone who is a professor in this field, when they see the play, they won't like call me out on it.
Right.
So sometimes as a dramaturg, my job is literally just to be there and say like, hey, you know, what are you nervous about in the text? All right, let's talk it out. Or to be like, hey, so this scene is a little superfluous. We can maybe cut this here. There have been other shows where there was a character that was a CEO at a marketing company in the play. And that was, you know, a necessary plot point. And there was a monologue where the character talked about what they did at work that day. And my job was to double check to make sure that, like, is this actually what this person would do at work that day?
Right.
You know, if a CEO saw this show, would this take them out of the action if they were like, oh, well, that's not right? So I was sending emails and making phone calls to marketing firms around New York being like, hey, what does your CEO's daily workflow look like? And sometimes it is like, it's more of a writing partner relationship. Sometimes you're just the one who makes a lobby display or writes the program note for the audience saying like, hey, this show is going to be about the Troubles in Ireland. Here's what you need to know. Otherwise, sit back and enjoy.
Right.
And also dramaturgs sometimes serve as literary managers. So you'll be the person at a theater that, you know, reads all of the submissions that you receive, goes to see shows around town, and kind of keeps a running log of who's worth following, who, you know, maybe is right on the edge of writing something really great and could use some extra developmental support, and then making recommendations to an artistic director at the end of the season.
That's really cool. Okay, so yeah, it's many hats there then.
Yeah. And so in thinking about kind of what a dramaturg does and what a playwright does, I think one of the best places to start, kind of more so than dramatic structure, because dramatic structure is something that, you know, isn't unique to drama. Right. It's something that, you know, prose writers will use as well, screenwriters, all kinds of folks. It is generally exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, denouement. So it's kind of like, okay, we get to know the characters, conflict is introduced, comes to a head. We see, you know, what the conflict coming to a head means for everyone. There's maybe a chance for a reversal or something. And then we have the denouement at the end, which is generally in, you know, in a comedy, you know, things work out for everyone. In a tragedy, you know, you either go from good to bad or bad to worse, or bad to still bad.
So I work at a co-working space, which is filled with game designers, but I'm the only tabletop analog game designer. They're all digital. Yeah. And there's a group that gets together every week to talk about the projects that they're doing on the side or whatever. And denouement came up. And now it's right, it's a technical term. I was like, yeah, I know what denouement is. I'm an English major. And then somebody else in the room at that meetup who was also a writer was like, yeah, that's the falling action. And I was like, no, there's falling action, then denouement. And then he was like, well, then what's the difference? And I was like, oh, shit. So, I mean, I could Google this, but do you, not to put you on the spot, but like, where do, because I mean, I could see they burned the graph into my brain, the rising action, falling action, and the denouement is like a little line after the falling action. The falling action is just, what is that? Is that the immediate aftermath of the climax? Is that?
Yeah, I mean, it can really be whatever you want it to be. Mm-hmm. I'm not someone who's super legalistic about this, but I think that the thing that would separate it for me is that in the falling action, there is still room for doubt. You know, we're starting to see how things, you know, are turning out. Mm-hmm. But that is kind of prime territory for the author to throw a twist in. Or kind of in the case of playwriting, like a lot of the effective moments in plays will be when you frustrate the audience's expectations. Right. When, you know, you want the play to be believable, you want the characters to feel real, but the people are going to remember the moments where something happens that isn't what they expected. Right. And the trick is, you know, having that happen and then them thinking back and being like, no, yeah, this is the way it had to end. You know, this is, of course that happened. which is much harder than just kind of like, you know, giving them the wedding at the end of a comedy.
Yeah.
So the falling action, there is still a little bit of leeway. There's still some variables that you're seeing how they shake out. The denouement, I'd say you kind of more like, all right, you know where we are and we're not going anywhere else. And now is kind of like the moment where we're going to establish that, like, if we saw the play happening 5 years after this,
Right.
you know, we have a sense of where these characters would be. But in talking about like not being super legalistic about this, a lot of the playwriting that I work with is experimental and is plays in verse and is kind of a bit more avant-garde. And so in different ways, like intentionally ignores dramatic structure, kind of, or, you know, plays with it or just doesn't worry about it, which I think is fine. It's, again, one of those things of like, how much are you going to expect of your audience? You know, because from reading books, seeing movies, seeing plays, audiences are always going to kind of be trained to follow dramatic structure, whether they know what the denouement is or not.
Right.
And, you know, if you have a specific audience that is kind of like looking for weird stuff, you can kind of throw that at them. But it's always this kind of like this little dance of, you know, how much do I want to, you know, break the rules and still expect people to follow what I'm saying? Another of my favorite playwrights is Sarah Rule. And she has a really fantastic book that I'd recommend for any writers called 100 Essays I Don't Have Time to Write. And they're all super short 1 or 2 page essays that are not like about, here's how you write a play. They're all just like, umbrellas in theater are cool. Let's talk about umbrellas. Or I like stage fights. Here's why I like stage fights. Just like a lot of little bite-sized things about what makes theater special.
Right.
And she has a chapter on dramatic structure where I'm going to get a little PG-13 if that's okay with you.
Oh yeah, no, it's.
I mean, it's RPGs, but she makes an argument that, you know, like, yes, we got the was it Plato or Aristotle that gave us dramatic structure? Some Greek guy.
Yeah.
But we got dramatic structure from them, and they believed dramatic structure to be an arc, but they also believed the arc, all things in eventuality follow an arc. And it's also probably not a coincidence that the male orgasm also follows an arc. You know, when you start to think about like, what are the things in theater, in literature, in game design, and anything really, where it's like, okay, this is just something that has been done for years and years and years, and there are generations of people telling people this is the right way to do it. How much of this is, you know, a law and how much of this is just best practice? And so she makes arguments for writing more feminine dramatic structures, where there are a number of smaller climaxes throughout. And that is part of the reason why when I teach playwriting to folks, I kind of dramatic structure, just because I think dramatic structure is a tool that you can apply if you need it. Like if you have found a plot and you're like, I love these characters, but like, what are they doing? Then that is a great place where like, well, why don't we, you know, try and throw them into dramatic structure and see what happens. As far as playwriting, though, I think it's a lot more useful to focus on what is unique about playwriting. You know, why is it that you are writing a play and you're not writing a novel or a book of poetry or a screenplay? And sometimes that can be a weird line to walk because, you know, it isn't necessarily that folks perform it because a lot of poetry is meant to be read out loud. And it's not dramatic structure because, you know, there's plenty of prose that follows dramatic structure. There's also plenty of like storytelling traditions of, you know, kind of the Mark Twain type figure just sitting on the back of a porch telling an engaging story. So the thing that I have arrived at is really stage directions are part of what make theater unique. The fact that it is, you know, bodies, regardless of the shape or size or ability of those bodies, are implied in that, you know, these voices are being embodied. You have to have a stage for those bodies to be on, whether it is a, you know, a constructed stage or just a space. With that stage, you have access to choreography. You can move things on the stage. You can apply things to the stage. And then also, and this is kind of a gray area because I think there are plenty of plays that are wonderful dramatic literature that will never be seen. Just kind of the implied audience.
Yeah.
The fact that, you know, regardless of how many people see it or if or when it gets on its feet, you know, even if you were just reading a play, there is an implied audience. You're reading it in kind of a third person adjacent mode rather than first person.
Yeah, this is a thing that I feel very deeply about role-playing games as well. I mean, I currently, if you include like internet bundles and things like that, I own more role-playing games than I have, you know, years left to live on this planet.
Yeah.
And but I that doesn't mean I can't read them, and I can put myself into a state of mind where I imagine preparing and then playing a game so that I can understand the rules and what the rules are trying to say. I won't necessarily understand them the same way I would if I were to actually play it in some cases. But in some cases, I'm going to get pretty close because I'll have previous experiences and whatnot. And I think that like that state of mind is a very creative state of mind, and one that allows you to delve deeper into the work of fiction than you might otherwise. And I like specifically referring to role-playing games here as a work of fiction, but also as a play or whatever that you might otherwise delve if you were just reading it off a page as a reader reads a short story or a novel or watches a television set, which isn't to say that you can't engage with those on a deep level. It's just you have to bring more to it if it's not already asking of you to imagine that it's being produced in some way.
Yeah, as a publisher of dramatic literature, especially experimental stuff that some of it has still not been performed. I publish plays regardless of production records. I just the inverse in Plays in Verse is in part because I like poetry, but also because we are trying to invert publication and production models. There are a lot of really fantastic plays that, because, you know, they're not universal enough to get that acting edition that's going to get them in like high schools across the country, you know, they're never going to get like the bigger distributed printed edition because so many people think of plays just as instruction manuals. They don't think of them as literature on their own. They think of them as a means to an end. And as someone who also, you know, loves reading RPGs, you know, before I play them, regardless of if I play them, or even just as a designer myself to like, you know, pick and choose different rules. I've been reading Sorcerer by Ron Edwards recently, and I don't know if I have a group that would want to play it. I don't know, like I'm still wrapping my brain around some of the dice mechanics, but I absolutely love the idea of like telltale signs for characters and, you know, starting sessions off with kickers.
Yeah.
And I think that, you know, thinking of an RPG manual as an instruction booklet or thinking of a play as an instruction booklet oftentimes discounts like the creativity and artistry that goes into those margins. Because if you see a play, you're going to get an experience that you're going to experience the plot, but you're never going to get like the beautiful stage directions that a playwright wrote. And if you play an RPG, you're going to experience it, but you're maybe not going to see like the really, really thoughtful notes that a designer left for the GM that kind of, you know, helped to prepare this experience for you.
I mean, I joke about this a bit online, but I am dead serious. I have favorite calculator manuals. And it fits right into that exact same sort of situation where early calculator manuals had this not just tell you what you could do with the calculator, but had to tell you about the decisions they made designing the calculator, why they made them, and how you can use that to your advantage. And that is a story. Like, that's an interesting story to read, if you're not already turned off by how many times I've said calculator manual. And I think that it's of a piece of this, right? Like, it can be interpreted just as an instructional text, but if you look at it just a little bit harder, you can and just spend some time thinking about where it sits and why decisions have been made. There's not to hijack this, but this is also one of the ways.
This is your YouTube series.
That's true.
You can hijack whatever you want.
But you're teaching me. But this is also one of the ways that I came back to enjoying pro wrestling. When I was much younger, I enjoyed pro wrestling because I had great fear for what would happen to my heroes. And, you know, like, you see it through the eyes of a true believer. And then at some point I was like, oh, I'm too smart for that. That's not real. This is dumb. And then, you know, some friends of mine who were role players were like, yeah, but do you see what they're doing? Do you see the artistry and the craft in what's going on? And by the way, the artistry and the craft that you see is still a facade that they're putting on for you. It goes deeper than that. And when that happened, then I got to a point where I could engage with it and you know, fall in love with it again. And also on both levels, on the level of like, here's the story that they're telling, but also here's how they're telling the story, and how well do you think they did? And that actually reminds me of the play, and I'm forgetting the name now, but the play you were talking about before, that's just the lines that don't have
4.48 psychosis.
Yeah, like, I can imagine being a fan of that play. I can imagine owning the script, having read through it, and then going to see productions of it to see, not necessarily to see these words come to life, but to see how people decided to interpret it, how they decided to do things. And even then, if it's not horrible, you can go, oh, well, that was an interesting choice. I don't think it landed quite that well, but I appreciate that attempt, or, you know, what have you, which is really interesting. I like that way of engaging with things.
That's a lot of, like, I keep going back to Shakespeare just because it's, you know, a touchstone. Right. But I think a lot of the time you have to think about attending a Shakespeare show like that. Yeah. Because if you are going to see The Tempest, Caliban is racist. Right. You know? Yeah. There are some really toxic, you know, masculine, like, father ownership of daughter dynamics that are happening in that play. And so a lot of the time, you know, I will go to see these shows, and sometimes because I don't have a choice, sometimes because, like, I'm genuinely curious of, like, okay, there's some beautiful language in here, and they've received the resources to produce this play because it is something that they will get grants for. But if they don't address these things, is it, like, a responsible production of this play?
Right.
Also, there is a play called The Elaborate Entrance of Chad Deity by Christopher Diaz. It is a play all about rediscovering that love of professional wrestling.
Oh,
and
interesting.
It is really, really fantastic. And it was after reading that play that I kind of unlocked for me of, like, oh, hey, this is a lot of the same vocabulary.
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
Because I'm there for the narrative. Like, I am someone who, you know, like, if dancing was just a bit more violent, yeah, sure. There's also a really interesting, well, I've kind of lost my point now.
That's fine. I do that all the time.
Yeah, Chris Diaz is really great. Oh, I remember what I was going to say. I have not started watching wrestling, but I do really love reality television.
Okay, yeah.
I wasn't into it at the start of reality television when it was first like, okay, first seasons of The Bachelor, Bachelorette, first, seasons of Big Brother. The interesting thing now is that because we are a culture that has learned how these things work, that now when you're watching The Bachelorette, it is not, like, will they or won't they find true love? It is, all of these contestants have watched every show of The Bachelorette.
Right. Yeah.
They know they're being filmed at all times. They are going to try and sell a narrative. The Bachelor or Bachelorette knows that they are the host of this show and that they have to keep it interesting until the final episode. And the producers know in their edit that they are going to, be selling stories and trying to throw the audience off the scent. The easiest way to tell if someone's about to be eliminated on a dating show is if they are very present in an episode.
Yeah.
Because they know, like, well, they're going to be gone. We have to wring all of the narrative we can out of them. And it's kind of finding those middle areas, whether it's in a play or it's in wrestling or it's in reality TV, of when like the authentic moment happens, that I feel like that's the magical thing.
Yeah.
That's the magical thing about role playing too, is like when the thing happens that you're like, oh, wow, like that was a moment.
Right.
That happened naturally. In this world of artifice, we arrived at something like super genuine together. And it's that much more powerful because it took us by surprise. And so that's a pretty good transition to the playwriting teaching that I actually want to do for this. So I am going to do a little bit of a lesson plan.
That's great.
So this is something that was taught to me by Chiara Agria-Hudes. She won the Pulitzer Prize for Water by the Spoonful. Really wonderful person. I was lucky enough to work on the world premiere of her show, Daphne's Dive, while I was working at Signature in New York. And this is an exercise that she likes to do with her playwriting students. And as I've gone out into the world and taught playwriting to a lot of first-time playwrights, or a lot of writers who kind of already have their voice down, but are like, oh, what if I wrote a play? This is an exercise that I really like. And I'd love to talk with you some about ways that kind of this thinking might be applied to game design.
Sure.
Because I think there's a little bit of an overlap of how these tools can be used. So like I said before, one of the really unique things about theater is stage directions, is that you have this action that is unfolding in front of you, and it is immediate. There are bodies on stage, but in storytelling, sometimes you want to do things in the interest of the narrative that you cannot do literally on stage.
Right.
And so that is where design comes in. That's where metaphor comes in. So the first exercise is always to ask the group to write a stage direction that represents something that you cannot literally represent on stage. So a good example is, 100 years pass in the blink of an eye.
Yeah.
That is something that you cannot and should not do literally in a theater space. But there are a lot of elegant solutions for that problem of how do we communicate that to an audience. You can have a sound cue that is like a speeding up of time. You can have a lighting shift. You can have a set shift that maybe things kind of become degraded. You can have an actor who even just kind of like over, a few steps across the stage, you can see the progression of their posture changing.
Yeah.
And kind of the voice and the way that they interact with the world. Another thing is like, you can have a changing of the seasons where, you can have fake snow come in. You can have decapitations on stage with some, with some prosthetics and a whole lot of blood packets.
I think like one of the visual cues to that sort of stuff that I've always enjoyed is with the having the streamers of just red fabric that people pull out from it. Oh, it's so beautiful, and then like it tricks you into looking at it and going, oh, this is something horrible that we're witnessing, right? Like, it's one of those super effective, for me at least, effects.
Yeah, and so I think that kind of keeping that in mind, and as a playwright thinking about like, if I were an audience, what would be things that would be cool to see on stage? Because that is what you are giving them that they can't get in a movie, that they can't get in a novel, that they can't get in poetry. In a lot of ways, people are there for the artifice, you know? You are telling people, kind of like what I said before, is like, if you see a poster for, you know, a gameplay influenced play, then you're going to go expecting, you know, to have agency and to play games. And kind of just by virtue of the fact that like, hey, you're going to a play, you got a ticket for a play. People are going to be like, all right, well, let's see what they've got.
Yeah.
So the first exercise here would be, and we won't do it now because it would require stopping and waiting and things, but the exercise would be just asking them, you know, write a stage direction. Write a stage direction that you think would be cool. And then you would go around the circle and ask everyone like, all right, what are different ways that we can create the same thing through stage directions? And this is something that you see in game design a lot, you know, like kind of any mechanic for the most part is simulating something that you cannot do literally at the table. Oftentimes you're just simulating chaos in, you know, making decisions and weighted rolls and things like that. But a dynamic for, you know, like how much weight can you carry, or how much time passes, or, you know, any number of things.
When you think about like over the past 4.5 decades, how much creative energy was spent converting two numbers, a number rolled on a 20-sided die and a number rolled on your damage die, into some spectacular fictional or largely pathetic fictional, depending on what those numbers turned out to be. I mean, it's a tremendous amount of creative energy. We don't have a unit for creative energy. Maybe we need one, but
yeah,
like, and that's taking what you understand about the setting, what you understand about the fiction and the story thus far, but also very specifically taking something as vague as a number, right? Or no, vague's not the right word, because numbers are very specific, but you know what I'm saying? Like something, like just with the only weight it has is that it's larger than some numbers and smaller than other numbers. And that's, it's a really interesting hobby we have when you look at it that deep or that closely. Yeah,
and it's also something that like there needs to be a point of reference too.
Yeah,
you know, like a number is a very specific thing, but if you don't have an idea of what that number corresponds to, it's not gonna mean anything.
Right.
Like you have to understand the concept of like injury in order to know that a bigger number means you're hurt more. And so that is one of the things that I think that it can be fun in thinking of game design, you know, like what are the things that, you know, is something that would be cool to replicate in this setting, or that maybe needs replicated, and what are ways that we can approximate that in design form. And so the second thing is the opposite of that. The second thing is something else you can do in the theater that is very unique to the theater, are stage directions and design elements where, for lack of more elegant phrasing, the thing is the thing. So examples of this would be, there is a dog in the script, and instead of bringing out a, you know, a stuffed animal, you bring a live dog on stage. Or, you know, another thing where the thing is nudity is always powerful on the stage. You know, not necessarily because it's like titillating, but because that is something that there is no artifice in, you know, like, you know, that it is the actor who is, you know, taking off their clothes and bearing themselves to the audience. But that doesn't make it any less real. That doesn't make it any less of like a human making themselves very vulnerable in front of you. And so there are those two layers of like, oh, hey, this is something in the plot, but this is also like something that's happening right here. Food is another one. You know, people eating on stage, babies. Everyone loves a baby on stage. I mean,
and just bring pro wrestling back into it, because I am a creature of habit here. There's also the juice, right? There's hardcore wrestlers that will just fall on tacks.
Yeah.
And like the threat is they're going to land on a bunch of tacks that are on the mat, and then they do, and there's no magic trick. It's just that somebody slammed them onto a bunch of tacks, and now they, on their back and forehead, they have a bunch of tacks, and you're just cringing. And it's not particularly my favorite form of wrestling, but it exists. Yeah. And it gets a reaction because it is what it is. There's no way around it. You just witnessed that happening.
Yeah. And I think that, you know, as we think about, you know, what makes this experience unique, and, you know, like, why does this piece of literature need to be a play? Thinking, you know, in terms of that tool set up front can be very helpful in making something that is a uniquely theatrical experience. And so the next step of the exercise would just be asking everyone to come up with an example of something where the thing is a thing. You know, what is something that you can have in your play that is equal parts narrative or metaphor and equal parts reality? So a good example from one of these workshops was having a character sew a dress on stage, you know, over the course of the entire play. And then at the end of the play, they remove their tunic and they put on the dress that they've made. And like, we were all a part of this. We are all privy to this creation of something. I really want to have a play where someone like removes their contacts or takes off their glasses midway through the play. And just, you know, there is something about like, oh, your relationship to the space changes, you know, because you just did a very real thing and kind of like handicapping yourself here. And one of the things that, and this is kind of a combination of the first and the second, one of the things I really like about Dread is that the Jenga tower or tumbling blocks tower is one of those things where the thing is the thing. Like, you have a tension of something falling over. It is still a mechanic that is being used to simulate something that you cannot do literally. But it is also something like you are creating a tense situation to mirror a tense situation.
Yeah, yeah.
And so when it falls down, it feels real. A friend of mine, Murph Murphy, has a little game that I want to make sure I plug his website. It's at www.dinosaursAreCool.com/tabletop. It's called Jurassic Central Park. And all of the challenges are resolved over the course of the meal. And it's how fast you can either eat your wings or celery. And he has, you know, values for like, okay, critical success is within 2 seconds, you know, mixed success is within X seconds. And you are playing herbivores and carnivores.
Right.
And you are attempting, you know, carnivorous actions. And how much you succeed is how quickly you can eat this wing. And so invariably you wind up like just becoming an animal because you're like, I gotta get, especially if it's a flapper and not a drum, like, all right, I gotta get this down in, you know, 3 seconds if I really want to get this thing that I want. And so it's plays like that that I get very excited about, you know, like, okay, this could only be a play. Right. It's not going to be as powerful otherwise. And I really love games where, you know, mentioned it earlier, where like the medium is the message, you know, that you are doing something that has an implication and that has kind of like an aura beyond just like what is the environment in the narrative. It's also kind of affecting the environment at the table.
Yeah, yeah.
Which is also why LARPing is cool.
Yeah,
yeah.
I mean,
a lot of interactive theater is just one-sided LARPing.
Yeah, yeah. Like, I am not as well versed in LARP as I am in tabletop, but so perhaps I'll have to do a person teaches Eppy about LARP at some point.
Yeah, I would watch that.
But like a lot of the stuff you talk about makes me think of LARP experiences that I've had in the past, or just ones that I've heard about. LARP has I think well, I'm not gonna make value judgments. Instead, I'm just gonna say they have a very robust verbal or folkloric history of what has happened, which is really neat. Like they're LARP. In some ways, you can engage with LARP communities and just find out about specific things that have happened at games that now are, for all intents and purposes, events, right? Like this is a thing that happened. It's a fictional thing that happened, but we witnessed it. We were there when it happened. And so it is as if it were a historical event, right? Like which is really, really neat. And you can get that with tabletop, but on a smaller scale, and I don't feel have as big of a network of people who are interested in hearing about what happened at that one time. But that's probably another talk. That's person teaches Eppy about sociological something or other. There's plenty. I could be taught so much, mainly because I forget it almost right after I've learned it. So
that's why you got to record all these things. You
can
just go back and watch it later. But it is kind of like a double-edged sword, thinking of some of the LARPing experiences that I've heard, and also some of the theater experiences I've been a part of, where if I'm ever working with a playwright who wants to include a racial epithet in their writing, that is another thing where the thing is the thing.
Yeah.
If this isn't something that this says something very specific about the character and, the audience's relationship and understanding of the character, it's not to say those things are forbidden, but it is to say that I'm always going to ask the playwright the question, okay, are you just trying to make him unlikable? Because we can do that in other ways.
Right.
Or are you trying to say something very specific about this character's perception and relationship to race? It's a similar thing where it's ableist language or depictions of, abuse on stage.
Yeah.
There are plenty of ways that actors can, have a hand over their throat so that when somebody is grabbing at their throat, they're not actually grabbing at their throat. But if they're good actors, that's still going to be something that might be triggering to someone in the audience.
Right.
And that isn't to say no choking in plays or, or just hey, do it badly so everyone knows it's fake. But it is worth asking yourself those questions. Am I doing this thing just because man, that would shock them? Or am I doing this thing because this play will not be complete without it? And there are definitely, game scenarios that can be applied to too. Are you trying to say something about your character, or are you just trying to be contrarian or, extra for being extra's sake? And so the last part of the exercise, and my favorite part, is so we've come up with non-literal representations of things on the stage. We've come up with things where it is a literal representation on the stage. The third part of the equation is trying to come up with things that are impossible to do on the stage. What is a stage direction that cannot be recreated on the stage? I have not found one yet, because invariably this exercise starts with, sharing some examples and sharing some brainstorming. And then once someone throws something out there, like, okay, I've got it, you go around the circle and see if someone can come up with an answer. And almost invariably, there is always someone who can. The prime example that Kiara uses is one of her students said the audience dies. The stage direction is just the audience dies. And they were okay, how do we do this? And the solution was you have the actors on stage directing their lines towards the audience. You are in a hospital room. It becomes clear throughout the course of the play that they are talking to a family member who's on life support. You can hear the beeping in the sound design. And at the end of the play, it flatlines and the lights go out and the audience died.
So
because you are treating the audience as that character. Another one that we came up with was the audience forgets they're watching a play. Not, improv everywhere. They realize halfway through, like, oh, a play is happening around me. But you bought tickets to a play. You got a babysitter. And it's not even like, oh, really believing the world of the play. You forget you're at a play. And the solution that we found to that was you show a 2-hour movie in the middle of a play. Because people forget that they're at a play because they're at a movie. And then the movie ends and like, oh, a play's starting again.
Yeah.
And so that is something that can really foster creativity in playwriting, because as we are thinking of like, okay, how do we not write the same play that has been done 100 times before? And even if we are, leaning into dramatic structure, how do we do something or say something that is unique, and not from like a soulless marketing perspective, but it can be helpful for that too. Like, it is hard to make a living as an artist, and not just like selling your shows, but getting interest from producing bodies, even if it's like an avant-garde nonprofit producer. What is the thing that your play is going to do that's going to set it apart from the other 100 plays that they've read that day? And sometimes it takes you trying to figure out, like, what's the thing that I can't do that I'm going to push myself to find a way to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. No, this is good. And it's absolutely applicable to game design. I mean,
I've been trying to think of like what an impossible representing games would be.
And I think it's not only like, I think this is definitely going into my back pocket as something that I'm going to bring up when I talk to, when I go and see my fellow game design friends Friday morning for coffee. I'm going to blow their fucking minds.
Yeah.
Because I know that they're not going to spend any time watching me talk on the internet to someone else. So I'm going to be like, hey, guess what I learned? And then unless they're watching this now, and then they're like, oh, Eppy, we watch you idiot. But yeah, I think that and let me just state it back to you. So I'm like, the first thing you want to do is you want to come up with something that would be difficult to do on the stage, and then everybody come up with something that you can't literally represent on the stage, and then find ways to represent
a solution. So kind of in the back of your mind, like, what's something that, usually we couldn't do, but because of theater magic, we can do.
Yeah. And then something where the thing is the thing. And what I'm noting in the examples, and really in my exploration, as I'm just thinking about it and imagining it, almost always that is, oh no, maybe I'm wrong. I'm just thinking like it's quite often something, no, it's exactly what you said it is. It's a real thing. That's all it is. It's something that's real, that's representing itself. I think in some aspects, it has to be something real that's representing itself in a way that feels either dangerous or magical in some fashion. Like I'm thinking about your dress.
I mean, I think that reality is magical.
Yeah.
Like, I think that realness in the middle of artifice is the magic. You know,
Yeah.
one of the hardest things about theater, and oftentimes like what we'll find as we talk about, you know, the impossible stage directions, almost all of those, the thing that you can't control in a play is the audience.
Yeah.
You know, there are ways that you can kind of simulate that, but in the same way that like, you know, you can't control what's going on inside the head of, you know, someone playing a game. You
Right.
can tell them, you know, like if you do X, you will get Y.
Right.
But even then, there are some ways that like smell is something where the thing is the thing. You know, it could be as much as like, oh, we're going to have food on stage. And also like, it is fresh out of the oven.
Yeah.
You know, hunger is a thing where the thing is real.
Yeah. So it's yeah. And then finally the impossible thing, the thing that you, and, oh yeah. I can see that being very, very fruitful.
Because I'm trying to think of examples of things that like approach that in games, and like examples of things where like I wouldn't think this would be possible, but someone has come up with a mechanic for it. Like one kind of like loose example, I think in a lot of different ways, is just experience. You know, someone learning and experiencing and like actually learning as you go, versus, you know, knowing the rules and knowing like what is the thing that like, okay, at level 3 I get this. And there are some games where like, okay, the mechanics emerge as you play it. So as your character learns, you are learning. And that's, you know, some of the cool things about like deck games or legacy games where like, okay, you open this bag later.
Yeah.
You know, like surprise is something that you can simulate, you know, even if you know that like, okay, yeah, we're sitting down to play this game. But again, it is things that I think that like things that are more on the side of the player, like you can explain to someone like, here's the challenge rating for the charisma roll that you have to do. But how do you have a game mechanic that like gets someone to feel what it feels like to fall in love, or heartbreak, or loss or something, you know?
That's where we have to bring Emily into the conversation.
Exactly, which is also why like I am so excited for Starcrossed.
Oh yeah, and definitely the Alex Roberts.
Alex's game.
Yeah. Sorry, my old man body just had a cramp while I was trying to answer or trying to say something there. It made me lose my train of thought. So I'm going to let that go. And if it comes back, it'll come back.
Yeah. So the 3 things are something you can do, you couldn't do on stage, but you can do through theater magic. Something where the thing is the thing, and a challenge to yourself to try and do something that is impossible, to try and come up with something that is impossible. And as you know, I don't do a lot of playwriting, just because I think I am far too hard on myself in a lot of ways. It's very hard as like a professional editor of plays to get past that first draft. Because I am self-editing as I go, and eventually I'm just like, why did I even bother? It's much easier for me to like take something that someone else has already written and be like, hell yeah, this is really good. I'm gonna, you know, help share this with everyone. But as a game designer, and, you know, as someone who writes for my own little campaigns and things like that, it is this kind of like this middle zone, and kind of thinking in terms of like, okay, what's the prop that I can bring to tonight's play session? Or what's the hack that I can incorporate into this game from this indie game that, you know, will help to unlock this thing? That, you know, that because we are in this kind of like varying levels of rigorous situations where we can like you know, have these dialogues and have these experiences in a safe space.
Yeah, yeah. I was thinking about the impossible thing, and I think the thing you were describing, where you go through the exercise, and then you get to the end, and you try and think of the impossible thing, and then by that point, everybody is prepped to find the solution for whatever that problem is. That's great stuff too. I mean, like, that's what I like to. I'm like, that's good game design, even though that's me grabbing another field and saying that belongs in mine. But I see that happen in discussions about game design all the time. I see that on kind of a smaller scale, but people will say, "Oh, I was in this game, blah 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 happened, and it sucked because blah blah blah," and everyone's like, well, not everyone, but people are primed to respond like, "I would love that game," because they're solving the problem in their head that wasn't solved at the table when it was happening, and it makes it in some ways very difficult to talk about what went wrong, because you can imagine it going right.
Yeah.
But in other ways, that imagining it going right can be taken all the way to the end and turned into another game that literally does that, right? Like,
yeah,
if people are like, "Oh, I can't stand encumbrance, blah blah blah," on one end, and then you go to the other end and you're like, "I'm playing Torchbearer, where the number one thing we worry about is whether or not we have enough room for our rations."
Yeah.
And if we can consume the rations at the right pace so that we can pick up some treasure to go back and buy more rations, so we come out here and be miserable in this cold, dank dungeon.
Yeah.
And that's fun. It's a thing that I enjoy doing. So, yeah, I think that's a really, really neat process.
And some of the magic too is like in hearing you talk about a game where like encumbrance is something that is really, you know, engaging and fruitful, and that is like a narrative driving thing. Yeah. You know, it's the same way with like a lot of the, you know, Twitter threads that you will see of like, "Oh, this was the greatest play session ever," or like, "Oh, we did this play test of Blades in the Dark, and here's all these different things that happened," which doesn't mean that like that isn't something that you could have a similar experience. But a lot of people will hear like anecdotal evidence for games or for plays and things like that, and they'd be like, "Oh, you know, Tyler said that 4.48 Psychosis is one of his favorite plays, and he saw this beautiful production." And then you go and play it with friends, and you're like, "Oh no,
right,
this is, I'm not getting that. I was told that encumbrance like was the game," or it's like, "Oh, Tyler liked this play. This seems like pretty, you know, pretty bad."
Yeah.
And I think sometimes the trick of playwriting or game design is knowing like, how much do you need? How many rules do you need? How many stage directions do you need? How specific of a character description do you need in the cast breakdown in order to make sure that like, okay, anyone who picks up this game, maybe they're not going to have the same experience, but here's the thing that when they look back at this game 5 years from now, they're going to remember like, "Oh yeah, Torchbearer did rations really good."
Yeah.
Or look back at a play and be like, "I don't remember everything exactly, but like that moment when they brought out the roast beef and like all of us were hungry together, and then they distributed roast beef sandwiches to the audience, was really beautiful."
One thing that intrigues me, this is a little bit of a zig here, but or a zag, whatever. Writing a play, and again, this like my filter is game design for most of this stuff, anyways. But like writing a play, you're writing it for people who are then going to be performing it for an audience. So in your mind, I assume you have at least at least two audiences in mind: the people that are going to perform the play, whatever roles they're going to take, and then the people that are going to witness that performance. And it's a thing that, like, it took me a while to get to thinking about in role-playing games, but once I did, it felt like, oh, this is a thing I should be worried about, even though quite often the people that are the audience that's witnessing the performance are the same people who are playing it. I needed to, in my mind, treat them as different so that I could feed both animals, if you will. Are there techniques? Is this a thing that is talked about in playwriting, or is this just Eppy being weird and
no? I think there's definitely a good point there of, like, you have to be aware of, even kind of rewinding from a production, but thinking in terms of, like, what is a director's experience reading this, and what is a actor's experience reading this, and what is, just someone who didn't live in Chicago for the 3-month window when the show was going.
Right.
Like, what are these different people looking for in this text? And a lot of times, like, it depends on how aware of an audience you need to be for the purposes of this play. So one of the plays that we published is a one-woman show. It's a very personal show. It's very unlikely that it's going to be performed by people other than the author. We still want to publish an edition of it because, Vicky can't visit, every city in America, and that people should still, have the opportunity to hear what she has to say. But as she is writing that piece, she is writing for a readership, and she is writing for herself. Mm-hmm. She's like, I know the things that I unconsciously do on stage every time I perform this show. How do I make sure that I am writing out stage directions for the things that, like, I'm not even thinking of, so that the reader will have a clear image of it? And also, if 15 years down the line, I decide to do a revival of this, that I can remember the choices I made when everything was still fresh in my mind.
Yeah.
I think that there are different kinds of readers in terms of, like, what are you looking for from a play? Like, are you looking to sit down and have an entertaining hour and a half? Or it's like, well, I want to read some. I don't have the time in my life for a novel right now, but I could finish a play cover to cover in, like, the time it would take to see it, usually faster because I don't have to wait for transitions. Yeah. Or there's the person who is reading a play looking for a juicy monologue. Maybe they're looking for a juicy monologue for a specific age or demographic, or, they're auditioning for a comedy and they've got to have a comedic monologue. So when they're reading it, maybe they're like, hey, if I imagine myself as this voice for the play, is this something that I could see myself in? There's also the question of, like, and this is sometimes in terms of game design, like, how crunchy you want a system to be, or how much you want to care about that. I oftentimes tell playwrights, if they're writing a play and they're like, this is a cast of 30, it would be really hard for someone to actually produce this. Or, like, well, I have this stage direction that might be impossible. I have this character cutting himself, and then his blood comes out, and that blood becomes a character and starts talking to him. I don't know. A producer might look at this and say, yeah, this is more trouble than it's worth.
Right.
And it's the same way with players. Someone might look at, like, a really thick tome and be like, uh-oh, no, that's not for me. And sometimes if you're trying to make a living as a game designer, or if you're trying to make a living as a playwright, yeah, you've got to write for an audience. You've got to write for actors that are out there, like, not specific people, but knowing that, like, hey, it's going to be harder to cast a show of, like, entirely octogenarians.
Right.
You also kind of have to write for something that's going to be affordable for theaters to produce. But I'm also a strong proponent of, like, hey, if it's good literature, like, if this is a story that you can't tell with less than 30 characters, write it. Yeah. And eventually, if someone loves it enough, they'll find a way to do it with 30 characters, or they'll find a way to do it with 15 actors, each playing 2 roles. A lot of the time, like, it is just kind of trusting that theater is unique from other literature, also that it is a collaborative medium. You know, there is always going to be a third party who is interpreting the things that you've written down. And sometimes it's just a matter of like, okay, I know what I'm going for here, but I'm going to trust that if someone engages with this enough and is passionate, a way to make it work.
Yeah. That's that trust. That's another interesting thing from the game design point of view, is that oftentimes when I'm writing a game, I have a specific thing that I'm trying to say. Sometimes it's about game design in general, but sometimes it's about the fiction that the game engages with. And one of the things that I have to do is design the game to say the thing I want it to say, and then just trust the game to say it, and trust the people to do with that what they want to do with that. Like, it's not my job to you know, I don't have to treat them like a dog and rub their nose in it if they don't play it the way that, or what have you. But it's a weird level of trust to be in, because before you get to that point, I'm talking to you as if this is a universal experience. Before Eppy gets to that point, I have to dig deep and assume that I'm going to accomplish it, and that all people engaging with it will want to engage with it the way that I'm doing it. And then I can come back out of that, and then once it's out, and say, okay, here it is, do with it as you will. But those two Eppies aren't the best of friends. They're not. One of them's a little more laid back than the other, and the one that isn't laid back is the one who gets the job done. So, yeah.
It's also an exercise in, like, I don't know if ego is the right word, but like vulnerability and comfort with, you know, how okay with you are you with people maybe missing the point, you know? Like, if this is something that you're putting out into the world, like, have you reached a point where you're like, I've done everything that I can, and, you know, someone might perform this play in a way that is, you know, ableist and, you know, misses my point entirely. But, like, is it on me? And that's kind of something that everyone needs to figure out on their own. For some designers, that's like, well, are you going to hit this Kickstarter deadline, or are you going to give it another play test where it's like, okay, no, this is solid. Yeah. And some people are great about, like, shrugging that off. And other people are, you know, precious isn't the right word, because those feelings are valid. Like, this is your baby, you know, and you're never going to have complete control over it. But, like, are you ready to kind of, like, send it out into the world and push it off the nest?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, like, in this brave new world where we have the YouTube and the Twitch, and people are playing your games and performing them in ways that you can reach out and watch from at any moment from across the globe. I have a lot of trouble watching other people play my games if I'm not there playing it with them. And it's not, no, it's exactly that. It's not that I don't trust them. It's that I still don't want to see something happen that would break that trust. Right? Yeah. Like, that's
I work, one of my many part-time jobs is I will work professionally as a freelance copy editor. I have a very hard time reading anything that I've copy edited.
Yeah.
Once it goes to print, just because I know that if I came across something that I missed, it would, like, eat at me forever. And that is, you know, my cross to bear, in that it's something that, like, okay, I either need to work at overcoming this, or, like, it's okay if some things in my life are for a time, and I don't return to them because I know it wouldn't be healthy. So I know we're like getting closer to the time that we were going for.
Yeah.
So I wanna zag to one other thing.
Sure. Yeah.
That I think is related, but also that is super relevant to game design, and a project that I'm working on and off. Have you ever heard of devised theater?
No.
Devised theater is very fun. It's something that it's a relatively modern trend in the theater. Like most things, it probably started in Europe. But devised theater is a theater creation process. So it is less of like, okay, devised is not to like comedy or tragedy. It's not like, oh, you have a funny play or you have a devised play. Devised is more to like the work of an auteur, you know? So a devised experience is when you just get a bunch of actors together. Maybe you have a director in the room, maybe you have a dramaturg in the room, but you have like 6 people and you're like, okay, let's make a play. And you start to improvise. And sometimes there is more structure, sometimes there is less structure. Sometimes you go into the room with the idea of like, okay, this is something that we want to do a play about. And we're not sure exactly what it is yet, but we know we all feel really strongly about it. Let's try and find that together.
Yeah.
A devising experience I was a part of, I was on the dramaturg of a show that we did here in Pittsburgh about just the really messed up demographics and lack of diversity that happens in Pittsburgh, specifically relating to the Hill District of Pittsburgh. Essentially, there's a community in Pittsburgh that used to be an integrated community, but then it was plowed to build a hockey rink. And Pittsburgh has since been one of the most segregated cities in the country because, you know, folks had to move in with their extended families, and that invariably wound up resegregating the city. So we went into the process knowing that, like, hey, we want to write about this thing that is still real and present in Pittsburgh, but we don't know exactly what that's going to be yet. Let's throw some stuff at the wall. So one of the things is we had a town hall. We had a whole bunch of people from Pittsburgh come in. We asked them questions and associations. We wrote them all on the wall on like big sheets of paper. And then when we came in the next day to improvise, we were like, okay, actors, look at all these words on the wall and see what that brings out in you. Sometimes there will be a playwright in a devised process where they will be like, hey, everybody, the conversation we had yesterday was really great. I wrote 5 pages last night. Let's perform those 5 pages together and then just keep going. You know, start to improvise what happens next. And then maybe we'll keep some of it. Maybe some of it we'll throw away. Sometimes there's also a director in the room. Like I said, sometimes there's a dramaturg in the room. It was like, okay, we're having a lot of fun. And we have these like 5 discrete little scenes that we've made that all kind of go around this theme of like love and how love, you know, transcends bodies and genders and all these different kinds of things. So they're all about love, but how can we daisy chain them together into something that is a theatrical experience that will like make sense if an audience goes and sits these and sees these in succession. So sometimes it's just finding the transitions, but it is the closest to really like role-playing emergent narratives that I have found in the theater, because it's not like going to an improv show where it's like, hey, here's the thing, you know, you're going to give us a word and we'll improvise a story and then it's gone, which is great. It is like, hey, we're going to get together and we're going to like improvise once a week and we're going to write it all down. And at the end, maybe we'll have something we're really proud of. And we can perform it for others. So there is a script at the end of the process, but you don't always start with one. And it's really interesting. And it's also one of those things that can either work really well or really poorly, because you have some people who look at it like, hey, you know, children being separated from their families at the border is something that is a real problem right now. and we want to do a play about it right now, because who's to say that everything won't have changed in a month or a week or a day? If we go through the process of writing a play and workshopping a play and editing a play, you know, by the time it gets up, you know, something else has happened.
And I would imagine in this particular instance, one of the things you would want to do is to just record the raw emotion of what the current experience.
Yeah, it's going to feel less real.
Because especially in this environment, not to get too into it, but like 2 weeks from now, every 2 weeks you feel like it's a completely different world, and you know, and so being able to capture some of these moments in ways that just I could see like a whole process of doing a play would run the risk of just losing the thread of why you wanted to do it in the first place.
Yeah, devised theater is also hyper local. Because by design, it is being created in the city it's going to be performed. You get a lot of shows that go up in New York and are about New York, and then a year later get performed everywhere. But like the Rust Belt can't identify with rent being high, and they are not going to, you know, identify with like the plays that were about a social issue that was like, you know, really big last year, but now maybe we've actually like, oh, there were a lot of shows about like we're not allowed to get married, and then a year later it's like, oh well, actually like this is a history piece now, because, you know, people of all orientations can get married depending on different bullshit. So there are a lot of advantages to the fact that it is quick, it is immediate, it's raw. Sometimes in found text can be used really well. So maybe you like quote a piece of the newspaper or an interview with someone, and it's very raw and real and speaks to the present moment. And then you are adding in the kind of narrative connecting bits in between the verbatim theater. It's also something that can be very lazy and very disorganized. Because there are just as many, and I love actors. I was an actor. I don't date actors. But there are some people that would just be like, hey, why do I need to be cast in a show? And we can just make our own show. Why do we need a playwright? Why do we need to pay royalties for something? We can just make our own thing. Let's all just get in a room and get some pizza and beer, and we'll make our own play. And sometimes that works really great. But a lot of the time, it just winds up being like, oh, this is Ben's scene. This is Sarah's scene. This is, you know, so-and-so's scene, where it's very clear there's like, okay, this is a weird little showcase that's been thrown together. Or it's like a piece of experimental theater. It's like, well, they were all thinking of something, but like, this isn't a play. You know, there isn't like, you know, not that there needs to be an arc, but there needs to be a line.
Well, yeah, it's experimenting in, and inherent in experimenting is the risk of failure. And
and kind of the simpler you get too, it's like, you know, there are some people who see something as like, take self-publishing, for example. There's some people who see the affordability of self-publishing as something as like, yes, I can chase this dream that was closed off to me before, and I'm going to work super, super hard because now I can put it out and I can get it in people's hands. And there are some people who look at self-publishing and be like, oh, this only costs like $100 to make, you know, 50 copies of this book. Cool. I'm not even going to edit it. Like, I don't need an editor. I can just put it out. And in a lot of ways, like, it depends on the person. It's like, okay, how self-motivated are you? But the experiment that I've been doing is the thing that is lacking from a lot of these devised processes are RPG mechanics, you know, are these guiding forces of like, you know, get the 5 people in a room to improvise, but set up a Jenga tower. Each scene, take out some blocks, and when it falls over, that's your cue that like something has to turn in the plot of the play. That's when the climax happens, regardless of where you are. Or even things as much as like, okay, how do we avoid creating a piece of canned theater? What's the one thing that's hard to simulate in our improvising process? and that's randomness, you know, like rolling a dice or making character sheets or things like that are things that I think like the place between devised theater and RPGs is what's really been getting me excited recently.
That's awesome. Yeah, like in some ways. So I don't know if you've heard about or the playstorming stuff that I've done.
Yeah. Which I think is something that would be super badass even to do as a performance art experience. Like get 30 people in a room. Say like, hey, who has something they want in the game? Who has something they don't want in a game?
Yeah.
You know, have a moderator, you know, work with an audience, and then at a certain point be like, okay, there are 5 volunteer game masters split up into groups of 6. We're going to project the rules on the board here. And if something doesn't work, just tell us, and we'll just say to the group like, hey, everybody, you know, doubles are, you know, instant successes now. Or like, hey, everybody, that thing that we came up with isn't working, so just strike it.
And yeah, I mean that's interesting. You got my brain going. Well, the thing I was going to say about the playstorming is that we, being game designers, we designed the game mechanics behind playstorming, and so it very specifically has some rules that we follow that we found helped keeping it going and whatnot. And I would be really interested in seeing like how devised plays, like what set of rules end up being fruitful for groups to make it so that they, I mean, again, fruitful, you know, like at any experiment, fruitful doesn't mean that you come out. Every game we playstormed did not become a game.
There are plenty of plays that are written that never get produced too.
And sometimes that is tragic in like the good sense, where I mean, I think amongst my group of friends, we talk about tigers riding bears, which was, I mean, title alone.
Yeah, no, that's great.
International bestseller. But and sometimes, so it's, you know, tragic in that, like, oh, I wish that would have come together and been a thing. But it was fun doing it, and it ended up being what it ended up being. And sometimes it's like, oh, you know, we followed this down to a dead end. Or sometimes, like, this is great. I actually am now satisfied with what this is. I don't want to publish it just because I got out of it what I want. You go and do what you want to do with it if you want to do something with it. And so all of that stuff is yeah, and I can see that happening with devised plays as well. If you have like clear sets of rules about like who gets to do what with the result, and
I mean, the fact that role-playing games and LARPing exists is already an argument for the fact that like a devised process can be fun and fruitful regardless of if a play comes out at the end. Same as like sitting around in a living room and reading a play with friends and all of you taking a role is really fun, because you get to like, you know, you hear like the laugh lines and things through a friend of yours who is, you know, like being funny for you. But it's definitely like, there are a lot of mechanics. I think one of the playstorming things was like, isn't there like, not necessarily like no's, but like, isn't there some kind of like just respecting people's agency and ideas? Maybe I'm thinking of something else.
Oh, okay. I see what I thought you meant no's.
Oh, no, like negatives.
Yeah. So one of the things about the playstorming is that you don't discuss what a mechanic can do. You say, here's the mechanic, let's do it. And of course, we break that rule all the time.
Yeah.
But the fact that the rule exists allows people to go, wait a minute, let's stop talking about it and try it. Let's just put it on the table. We can ignore it afterwards. One of the things that we do is we often have somebody who we refer to as the game bearer, who is just responsible for taking the game when it's done. So so we don't even have to worry about making the editing decisions. That's up to them. And then,
or even having like the night of the soul of like, do I really want to invest more time into this?
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
Oh, no, that's Rob's decision.
Yeah. It doesn't matter. Just do it, and then somebody else will have to deal with it. And we also talk about, like, one of the important things is watching other people play and looking for rules that they don't know they're using, which is super important, because you mentioned earlier that you were reading Swords Without Master. Swords Without Master came from a game called Monkey Dome, which was play-stormed. And one of the rules that in Swords Without Master came to be known as the Thunder, where when you introduce a scene, you give a distant threat, something that could be a problem, but isn't necessarily a problem right now. That just came from us while we were playing Monkey Dome. One of the players was doing it, and another player said, that thing you're doing, that's vital to what's happening here. It means that there's movement. It means that there's either a place for us to go after this if things go wrong, or a place, something to keep us, moving along. Let's write that down and make that a rule. And it became like, it's a rule that is very important in Swords, but not obviously important in Swords. And it's so important that I often think to myself while I'm working on other elements of the game, I'm like, does this phase have a thunder? If it doesn't, why would it not have a thunder? Because that's a super important thing for it not to, for that not to have. But I would say, from my personal experience, 80% of the time the thunder never comes up. Like, you present it while you play the game, but you never engage with it, because what you're doing there is you're just throwing things at the wall to see what sticks. And like that 1 out of 5 that does stick becomes memorable, and you're like, that's that's great. The other ones are just mood. They're just setting.
And I feel like that's something that game masters do unconsciously a lot. And just like, okay, you're going to throw out like 5 different potential adventure hooks, and the trick is just seeing which one the players gravitate towards. It's not that every single thing is vital. Another example that I think of is that I think just like was, probably a con rule, or like house rules type stuff, or like X cards that are now becoming key parts of mechanics of games. Where it's like, this is probably just something that you were unconsciously, or maybe like to solve a problem you did with a game once, that now there are games coming out that are specifically like printing X cards. And even just thinking of like how many devising or improvising processes would be that much more like smooth and fruitful if everyone was like, okay, you have like one card where like it doesn't matter if it's something you're uncomfortable with, or a role that you don't feel you could play, or just like you're not feeling it. Like, you have the agency in like the rules and the expectations of this process to say no sometimes, because it is just as dangerous to go into like a devising, improvising experience with no structure as it is with too much structure. Because if you go in like without any kind of guidance, then you're going to you might wind up with someone who becomes the de facto playwright just because they are the one who is the boldest in their ideas.
I mean, that's another thing about game design. We're talking a lot about game, but there's no such thing as no structure. If the game text doesn't give you structure, then the culture in which you're playing is giving you structure, and you may be able to depend on that, and you may not, depending on the situation. And that's just a reality. There's no getting around that. We are social animals who like to exist within our rules. So but that's a huge other discussion.
So kind of the thing that like all of this has been marinating in my head for a while, and I'm getting ready to grill it up. But and the kind of the form that I want it to take, just as someone who is a book person and who is a reader and writer and things, is there are books that exist for, I know of at least two that are like improv skills for role players. Like I think there's one coming out from Evil Hat sometime soon.
There might be. Yeah. I know. I can think of a few. I can't think of their titles off the top of my head.
Yeah, but they are very much like, hey, here's what yes and means.
Yeah,
and here's how you can incorporate that into your role-playing game. What I'm really interested in doing is writing the opposite for devisers, of just saying, you know, like, hey, next time you get in a room to kind of do this, like, play this game together to create this story, like, here's how incorporating dice can help. Or here's how incorporating a Jenga tower can help. Or here's how incorporating X cards can help. The biggest problem I have, though, is that I am also someone who respects intellectual property,
right,
and thinks that creatives should be paid for their work and credited for their work. And kind of in our discussion of like, even if no rules are the rules, that's the rules. Like, if it is a book saying like, here's the nug from this game, and I'm just going to steal it and put it in this book so that you can like have it for a different kind of game. Like, when does it stop being hacking and start being like, this is work and effort that you put into to go through these processes and arrive at this really elegant solution for, you know, you arrived at this formula for emergent narratives.
Yeah.
And like, how much is that like, is that also your like bread and butter? You know, especially people who are working game designers. And it's easy to forget that stuff in like the indie space because so much of it is like, yeah, fuck it, I'll put on a Google spreadsheet.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I could speak for myself personally, which obviously no one should assume that I'm speaking for anyone else in the industry when I do that. But I could say, like, if you're not reproducing the entire game, if you're just saying, you know, here's the thing I pulled out of Swords Without Master because I think the way the motifs work is precisely what we want to use to structure our thing. I'm completely down with that. I'm pretty sure my licensing agreement says that I'm down with that too. But
I don't know if you've heard, but Swords Without Master is in Volume 1, Issue 3 of Worlds Without Master.
Yes.
Word on the street.
Yeah. But yeah, exactly that. Like, as long as you say, hey, this is where I got it from, and if you're curious about other things, well, you don't even have to say that because curious people will go seeking it out. But like I said, that doesn't speak for everyone. But I bet you, if you were to put this book together and you contacted those people, you could get written permission from them, and they would probably talk about your book a lot.
Yeah, and hopefully, like, the ideal happy family scenario is that more actors start playing role-playing games.
Yeah.
Where they're like, oh, I'm actually going to go and buy, you know, a copy of Dungeon World or something like that. And, but it's interesting to think of this space as, you know, like, what is the thing? You know, when you approach a game, like, are you going to this book because, like, hey, I'm going to use, you know, I'm just going to do, like, an easy, like, over-under mechanic for my role-playing system, but I really love, like, the world of Dungeons and Dragons.
Right.
Or, like, are you going to something for the lore? Or are you going to it because, like, well, I want to tell this superhero story. I just need a way to decide if people succeed or fail or not.
Yeah. It's a real interesting question that I think we are right now
out of time to answer.
Yeah, well, I was going to say at this moment in history, we're dealing with in a very, very interesting way because people.
Well, at this moment in history, we might also be out of time.
That's true.
Who's to say?
But I mean, like with streaming, people are some people are making actually a living, quite a nice living, streaming and doing essentially, you know, television shows that are playing role-playing games. So I think that is generally a good thing. I think that leads to people buying the role-playing games. But there's certainly where you go, okay, where does that sit then?
There's a reason why there are licensing agreements.
Yeah, who's the playwright? Who's the dramaturge? What is going on here? Because that is definitely a different licensing agreement than a play would have, right? Like, so
the way I work with my publishing is because I publish plays that are protected by copyright. Yeah, and sometimes people reach out saying like, we want to perform this play, and I will say, that's great. Let me connect you with the playwright. I'm going to let them do the negotiating, and I'm just going to sign off on what they want, because my financing structure is not that I'm making money off of royalties and putting out acting editions. I recoup everything through book sales, because we sell them essentially like books of poetry. But it is kind of that question of like, okay, what is the playwright comfortable with?
Right.
Are they going to feel like their time is being and their effort is being valued if they, if they just know that it's being performed and they get a free ticket to the premiere? Right. Or is, even if it's like $10 a performance, is it worth it to say that like, hey, you're an artist who should be compensated? Or maybe it's like $100 a performance. There are also like a lot of weird things with rights and contracts when you get deeper and deeper into professional theater too. Like, one of the things is, if you are designing a poster for a play, a lot of rights agreements will specifically state the proportion by which the playwright's name is allowed to be in comparison to the name of the producing body and in comparison to the name of the play. They will straight up tell you like, the name of the play must be the biggest thing, and the name of the playwright can only be, 75% or larger of the size of the title of the play, and the producing body can only be half as large as the name of the playwright. It's madness. But and
it's, as somebody who people know Dread, and then far less than 75% of the people who know Dread know that I was involved in Dread. And it's just like, I can understand that concern, but also, I also
don't think we're that far though from just a kick-ass role-playing game that is very good for podcasts. Just the system is excellent for audio drama. And I wouldn't be surprised if we get to a point where it's like, hey, so anyone who wants can download and play this game. But if you want to do a podcast of it, here's how much you have to pay per episode.
Right. Yeah.
Or something where it's like, hey, the thing that is monetizing this game is like, it's open source. But if you want to do a show of it on Twitch, then like, that's when you need to pay for the rights. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I just think it's going to be a new thing, and something that definitely will change, how people are designing and also how people are playing. So I need to hit the old Dusty here soon.
Let's. Do you have any parting words?
In general, I think the biggest thing that I just say to anyone who is interested in playwriting is probably the same thing you tell to people who ask you about RPG design. The best way to do it is to do it. If you're interested in playwriting, if there's something that you want to say through a play, just do it. 90% of the time, the submissions that I get to my press, because it's a hybrid publishing company, we do a lot of weird stuff that's kind of in the middle of play and poetry. A lot of times my response to people is that like, hey, this is really good writing, but it should be a book of poetry. Like, this doesn't have to be a play. You're going to get a larger audience if it is a book of poetry. Or, I might say to someone like, these monologues these prose selections, these first-person writing exercises could be a collection of monologues, but it works really well as a collection of short stories. So as you kind of go into writing your first game or something, I think there is no shame in kind of getting halfway through the process and being like, oh, I just wrote a fantasy novel.
Right.
Like,
yeah.
I'm not really interested in coming up with bespoke mechanics for this. Like, I just want to finish telling the story of this country. So I think the hardest thing is just starting that creative process and then being fluid enough to know that it might become something different as you go. And then the next big start is share it with people. You know, like buy that pizza, buy that case of beer, invite your friends over, and just like have them read the parts. Just like you are not going to know if some game mechanics work until you know, roll the dice and see if it worked the way you thought it would or not. You're not going to know if like a line is actually funny until you hear someone that is not you say it. Otherwise, yeah, I'm really grateful for the chance to talk to you about this.
Yeah, this has been a pleasure.
Yeah, it's something that I'm passionate about. And I actually have a couple of projects that are kind of related to this right now. That if
please
anyone's interested, my first RPG book just got published last week.
Congrats!
It's out from Cool Skull Press, and it is a book of adventure hooks, very creatively named adventure hooks, by Tyler Crumrine. So if you go to coolskullpress.com, you can find it there. It is just a collection of 60 kind of like prose poem microfictions that are all very much kind of keeping with my love of giving people the tip of the iceberg and letting them fill in the rest. They are all just things that are that you can either just read them and enjoy them and be like, oh, that was a cool idea. You can roll on the table of contents and select one that is kind of like a challenge to incorporate into your game. For example, the shortest one is you can fly, but so can everyone else. So, you know, whatever. Or you can see them as like legitimate, just like launching points for a campaign. It's like, okay, this is what you start at and then go on from there. So it's a tiny book, only $9. Check it out if that seems like your thing.
Cool.
I also have my first short but full length game coming out at Big Bad Con.
Oh, exciting.
So I am part of their Baba Yaga's mystery box.
Nice.
They were kind enough to ask for first rights to that game as part of their Kickstarter fundraising. I think that's still going to be going on whenever this goes up.
This will probably go out tomorrow.
Yeah.
Because I do no editing until somebody teaches Eppy about editing.
Yeah. Well, you know, until then, just continue to have 3-hour conversations.
Yeah.
But that will be part of the Baba Yaga's mystery box. I'm going to respect the mystery and say not say too much about it other than like, this is my love letter to playwriting. It
exciting.
Is an RPG that straight up steals from a lot of playwriting mechanics and is also heavily influenced by the beginning of Final Fantasy IX. So if anyone understands those references, they might be able to kind of figure out what this game is about. But I'm really excited about it. And after Big Bad Con is over, I'm sure I'll be shopping that around. Lastly, my press is playsinverse.com, www.playsinverse.com.
Can I just ask real quick? Is it plays and or plays in
verse? So it'd be like the inverse of a play.
Yeah.
Plays in verse. Or just
also in verse.
In verse.
All right, good. I just wanted to make sure because people are going to be typing that in. So.
Oh, yeah, hopefully. We'll see.
Yeah.
We publish weird ass plays. So if that sounds like your thing, check those out.
Absolutely.
I'm on Twitter at a cool guy, cool guy. And also I would strongly urge folks to follow dev_Blair. I talked a little bit about Dev's work at the very start of this. Dev is the playwright that wrote A Game of Life, a dramatic ritual. That's DEV_BLAIR. They are a really, really promising young playwright. They are doing a lot of the heavy lifting and kind of investigating what room is there in the middle of RPGs and performance that can be found. And yeah, if folks want to find out more about that project, that's going to be the best place to kind of see when and where the next production is. They're out in Boston, so probably somewhere around there.
Well, they just got a brand new follower just this very moment.
Gender chaotic neutral. It's a very good username. But that covers it for me. Is
Excellent.
there any parting words from you, or are we feeling good about this?
This was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed, and I did learn, which is good. Not that I didn't expect.
Yeah, likewise. This was actually like my secret backdoor to talking to a game designer I really admire. So like throughout the conversation, you're like, oh, I'm taking it to game design. And I'm oh yeah, I served up just the right little playwriting insight that I can poach these ideas off from Eppy.
Yeah. And I just, presumably anybody who's watching this already knows who I am and where I can be found, but I'm at Eppidiah on Twitter, and dig 1,000 holes with the number 1,000, not the words, .com. That's my blog. Yeah. Man, I really, I got to get better at all of that, but I'll have someone teach me that.
Yeah, practice makes perfect.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, this has been a pleasure, and I'm going to stop this now so everyone can take a break and
write a play.
Talk to folks later.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. Write a play. Bye.